Welcome to the world of creepy horror story videos, where chilling tales await to send shivers down your spine. These unsettling narratives not only entertain but also delve into the depths of fear and suspense, helping us understand our darkest emotions. Prepare yourself for an eerie experience that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Story number 1. The house at the end of Hollow Ridge Road was a place that no one talked about but everyone knew. It sat at the edge of the woods, its crooked frame sagging under the weight of time and something much heavier. Locals called it the house that eats the living, though no one could say where the name had come from. No one had lived there for decades, not since the Grally family disappeared without a trace in 1972. Since then, it had been left to rot, the windows shattered, the front door barely hanging on its hinges like a broken jaw. Dylan and his friends didn't believe in ghost stories. They were 16, too old to be scared of old wood and bad memories. So when Jake dared him to step inside the house, Dylan didn't hesitate. Pride is a dangerous thing, but Dylan was too stubborn to see it. "Go on, man. $10 says you won't even last 5 minutes." Jake grinned, his phone already recording. 5 minutes? I'll do 10, Dylan shot back, trying to sound braver than he felt. The others laughed, but there was an edge to it, an unease none of them would admit. Everyone had heard the stories, whispers about the strange smell that drifted from the house on humid nights, the flickers of light seen through the windows when no one was inside. But Dylan told himself it was just old wiring, gas leaks, or maybe squatters. He shoved his hands in his pockets and walked up the creaking porch steps, ignoring the shiver that crawled up his spine. The door groaned as he pushed it open, the sound like a long, low moan. The air hit him immediately, stale, damp, with an undercurrent of something metallic. Rust, he thought, or blood. The floorboards flexed under his weight. He glanced back at his friends, giving them a cocky grin before stepping fully inside. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by shafts of moonlight coming through the broken windows. Wallpaper peeled like dead skin from the walls. Dust hung in the air like fog. Every breath tasted like mildew. "Don't get lost, man," Jake called from outside. "If the house eats you, I'm not coming in after you." The others laughed, but Dylan didn't. He moved slowly, the wooden floor creaking underfoot. The sound echoed strangely, like it was being swallowed by something deeper. He walked past the old living room, where the furniture was still there, though draped in white sheets. His eyes caught on something, a stain on the ceiling, dark red, too red to be rust. He moved on. 2 minutes left. Jake's voice was distant, muffled, too muffled. Dylan turned to glance at the door behind him and froze. It wasn't there. The hallway stretched on endlessly, far longer than it should have. The door he'd come through was gone. His breath quickened. He spun, eyes darting to the walls. They looked closer now, pressing in. "Guys," he called louder this time. No response. He ran back toward where the door should be, his sneakers slamming against the old wood. But no matter how far he ran, the hall just kept stretching, bending, the edges curving like ribs around him. He stopped, panting, heart racing in his chest like a trapped animal. This isn't right. He glanced back the way he'd come. It was no longer a hallway. It was a tunnel. The wallpaper hung like flesh from the walls, slick with something wet. The floor squelched underfoot, soft and spongy. The metallic tang filled his nose, stronger now. Not rust, blood. A low sound echoed behind him. Not a creak, not the wind. It was a wet, heavy sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. His heart felt like it might burst. Slowly, he turned his head. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but shadows don't crawl. The shape pulled itself forward on long, too thin limbs, joints bending in unnatural directions. Its head was wrong, more like a swollen lump of flesh than a skull, with a wide, open slit where a face should be. It didn't have eyes, but it saw him. He felt it. It opened its mouth. No teeth, just a dark pit. Don't scream, he thought. If you scream, it'll hear you. But it didn't need to hear him. It already knew. Dylan stumbled backward, his breath ragged as he tried to keep his eyes on it. His back hit the wall. It was warm, too warm. His skin crawled with revulsion as the wall flexed against him, pushing him forward. He spun, slamming his hands against it, but the wood was gone. The wall was slick with some kind of fleshy membrane, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. "Help!" he screamed, slamming his fists against the wall. "Jake! Help me!" There was no answer. He could hear them, though faint echoes of his friends laughing, their voices distorted, as if they were on the other side of a great distance. The thing was closer now. It didn't move like something that should exist. It dragged itself forward, one arm, then another, slow, deliberate. Not hunting, claiming. "Stay back!" Dylan yelled, his voice cracking. "Stay back!" It didn't stop. It didn't need to. The wall behind him gave way with a sudden, wet lurch, and he stumbled backward into it. His shoulders sank into the soft, fleshy surface, and panic shot through him like lightning. He clawed at the air, but his arms were pinned. The wall flexed, pulling him in inch by inch. "No! No! No! No!" he screamed, thrashing as the warm, wet flesh wrapped around him. His face pressed against it, and for a moment he swore he felt something breathing behind it. He kicked. He clawed. His fingers scraped at the surface until his nails peeled back. It didn't matter. The wall sucked him in, tighter and tighter, until he couldn't breathe. The last thing he saw was the thing crawling toward him, its hollow face inches from his own, tilted its head. For a moment it almost looked curious. Then it reached out and pressed one of its fingers against his forehead. Cold, sharp, final. He felt himself pulled back, deeper into the wall, deeper than the house should have been, deeper than any house could be. He tried to scream, but the soft, wet membrane covered his mouth, filled his throat, and swallowed his breath. The house eats the living. Outside, Jake checked his phone. 10 minutes. "I win," he said, smirking at the others. He glanced at the open door. "Yo, Dylan. Time's up, man. Come on out." No answer. Jake's grin faded. He called out again. "Dylan? Hey, stop messing around. You're not funny." Silence. The air changed. It was colder now. And from the house, something drifted out. A faint, metallic smell, sharp and wrong. "Dylan?" Jake said, stepping closer to the door. He peered inside, his phone flashlight barely cutting into the shadows. The hallway was shorter now. Too short. Jake stared, his brow furrowed. This wasn't like this before. From deep inside the house, something moved. He heard it clearly, wet, dragging sounds. His breath caught. The door, still open, creaked slowly on its hinges. Closing. He didn't wait. He ran. He didn't look back. Behind him, the door closed with a soft, wet click. Story number 2. The forest was alive with the soft rustle of unseen things. The autumn air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the pale glow of the full moon barely piercing the canopy. For as long as anyone could remember, the Black Hollow had been a place of whispered warnings and shared glances. No one in the nearby town of Graven's End wandered too close. It was the kind of place where silence felt predatory, where the absence of birdsong felt more like an omen than a quirk of nature. Jonas Fairweather had always been the type to brush off superstition. He'd grown up hearing stories about the Hollow, of people who vanished without a trace. Their names later added to the town's quiet litany of the taken. Old-timers spoke of eerie lights flickering between the trees at night and low murmuring voices that drifted on the air. The whispers, they called them. But Jonas was a man of practicality, and practicality had no use for tales spun by the fearful. He'd come to the Hollow that night chasing his dog, Scout, who'd bolted from the yard after a deer. Cursing under his breath, he moved deeper into the forest, sweeping his flashlight in wide arcs. Shadows leapt and stretched like specters, and every so often, the light caught the glassy glow of Scout's eyes reflecting back at him, just far enough away to keep him moving forward. "Scout, come on, boy, this isn't funny," Jonas called out, his voice muffled by the dense weave of branches. He hated how quiet it was. No wind, no distant hoot of an owl, nothing but the crunch of his boots on the forest floor and the thud of his heart. Every few steps, he'd pause, listening for Scout's barking or the jingle of his collar. But he heard something else instead. Whispers, faint, so faint he almost missed them. A hush of voices threading through the stillness, like someone muttering just out of earshot. He froze. His breath curled in the cold air as he swung the flashlight around. The trees revealed themselves in the shifting light. Bare trunks, crooked limbs, nothing unusual. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew clearer. "You shouldn't be here." Jonas's breath caught in his throat. The words were unmistakable. He laughed it off too loud, too sharp. "Great. I'm hearing things now," he muttered, shaking his head. He pressed on, his nerves tighter with every step. The whispers didn't fade. They followed him like echoes that didn't belong. Low, shivering murmurs that wove between the trees. They never rose above a murmur, never spoke in unison, but they were always there. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, other times like many. Scout barked somewhere ahead, a sharp, frantic yelp. Jonas's heart leapt. "Scout, stay there, boy. I'm coming." He took off at a jog, his beam of light bobbing wildly as he ran. The whispers followed. No, not followed. They surrounded him. "Too far, too far," the voices said, like the sigh of wind through reeds. His breath came harder as panic started to gnaw at him. He didn't recognize any of the trees anymore. Each one looked like the last thin, pale trunks riddled with dark knots that looked uncomfortably like eyes. No trail, no path, just endless trees all identical. Scout barked again, closer this time. Jonas pushed on, adrenaline driving him forward. But the moment he cleared a thicket of tangled branches, he stopped dead. A figure stood ahead. It wasn't Scout. It wasn't even human. At first, it seemed like a person, but as his flashlight beam settled on it, Jonas realized it wasn't a figure at all. It was a trunk, a hollow tree shaped almost like a person. Its bark twisted and split, creating a jagged hollow where its face should be. The hollow was deep, blacker than shadow, and it seemed to breathe. Jonas saw the bark shift, as though flexing. From that hollow, the whispers poured like a slow leak of gas from a crack in a pipe. "Too far," it whispered, the words spilling from the hollow like smoke. "Too far, too far." Jonas stepped back, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. His hands shook as he swung the flashlight around. More of them, hollowed-out trunks, each with that same jagged maw. They weren't there before. He was sure of it. But now they encircled him. Trees shaped like people or people shaped like trees. "Stay back," he croaked, his throat dry with fear. "I don't know what you are, but I'm leaving. You hear me? I'm leaving." The whispering surged, louder, like the hiss of insects swarming all at once. They didn't move, but he could feel them watching. The hollowed-out faces tracked him, though they didn't turn. He stumbled backward, breathing in short, shallow gasps. Another bark. Scout. Closer. Scout. Come here, boy. Jonas shouted, twisting toward the sound. He sprinted toward it, not caring if the branches clawed at his arms or the undergrowth tugged at his legs. The whispers screamed now, not in volume but in urgency. He didn't understand the words, but the desperation was clear. Don't look back, they begged. Don't look back. Jonas didn't listen. He glanced over his shoulder. One of the hollowed figures had moved. It was closer. The others too. They hadn't walked. They had just shifted, like a frame in a film skipping forward. Its hollow face was tilted toward him. The darkness inside churned like smoke caught in a glass jar. His legs nearly gave out, but he pushed himself harder, crashing through thickets, his flashlight flickering from the impact. The whispers filled his ears like static. Then he saw Scout. The golden retriever stood in a clearing ahead, barking at him with wild eyes. Jonas sprinted for him, so grateful he could have cried. "Good boy, Scout! Good boy!" he gasped, sliding to his knees and grabbing the dog by the collar. Scout licked his face frantically, his entire body quivering with fear. The clearing was silent, too silent. Jonas glanced back at the way he'd come, expecting to see the figures there. Nothing but trees. Still unmoving trees. No hollow faces. No jagged mouths. He laughed, short and sharp, almost a sob. "Stupid," he muttered, clutching Scout close. "Just trees. Just the dark playing tricks on me." Scout whined, low and sharp, his ears pinned back. His eyes weren't on Jonas. They were behind him. Cold breath tickled the back of his neck. Slowly, Jonas turned. One of them stood right behind him, close enough to touch. Its hollow face was inches from his own. The darkness inside churned and twisted, and from it came a single clear voice. Not a whisper this time. A voice. "You were warned." Jonas didn't scream. He couldn't. His lungs locked up as his body went rigid. He felt his breath being pulled from his chest, like a sudden vacuum had been opened inside him. The hollow tree's face grew darker, denser, and he felt something long and spindly reach into his mind, into his very being. His vision flickered as he was pulled inward, his thoughts no longer his own. Scout barked and barked, his howls echoing through the hollow long after the whispers fell silent. By the time the search party found him 3 days later, Scout was alive but skittish, his coat matted with leaves. As for Jonas, they found him standing among the trees, or perhaps as one of them. His eyes were gone, replaced by 2 hollow knots, his face locked in an expression of silent terror. His arms were raised like gnarled branches, bark-covered skin twisted with ridges. The townsfolk knew better than to bring him back. They knew where he belonged now. The whispers in the black hollow had claimed another, and the hollow never gave anything back. Story number 3. The forest didn't exist on any map. It wasn't marked by trails or signs, and no one in the nearby town of Gallows Reach spoke of it willingly. Tucked between 2 steep ridges of gray stone, it seemed to appear only when it wanted to be seen. Thick, black-barked trees pressed together like soldiers in formation, their gnarled roots twisting over one another in a tangled mess of wood and rot. During the day, it was hard to spot from a distance, but at night, it revealed itself. That was the only time it grew. Jacob knew the stories, but he didn't believe them. Folklore, town gossip to scare kids. But on the night of the blackout, with his phone battery at 5% and his house too far away to walk to, he decided to take the shortcut through the ridge. It would cut his trip home in half. His flashlight flickered in his hand as he climbed the rocky path toward the ridge. Wind whistled low and hollow between the stones. It smelled of earth after rain, though no rain had fallen. His breath fogged in front of him, even though it was mid-October and not yet cold enough for that. At the top of the ridge, he saw it. It wasn't a forest at first. It was a space, an absence, a jagged sea of black shapes below him. The flashlight barely penetrated the darkness ahead. The beam swallowed as if the night were thicker there. Jacob hesitated. This wasn't here before, he thought. He'd taken this shortcut last summer, and there had been no forest. It was just rocky outcroppings, a field of dead grass. But now trees, tall, too tall, rising like pillars in a cathedral. Their bark was darker than any wood he'd ever seen, black like coal, with jagged scars running down their lengths. He shined his light on one and saw that the bark almost looked burned, charred. His heart thudded once, twice. No, he told himself. Just trees. Just weird, ugly trees. He pressed on, descending the ridge. As he reached the bottom, the air changed. Denser. Still. The kind of stillness that makes your ears feel stuffed with cotton. No wind, no insects, no distant call of birds. Only the crunch of his boots on brittle leaves and soil. Every few feet he glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. Just trees. It's fine. It's just a forest, he told himself. Don't be a coward, Jake. He pushed forward. Each step felt like it should bring him closer to the edge, but every time he looked ahead, it seemed the forest stretched farther than before. He picked up his pace. His heart started to beat a little faster. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He yanked it out, eyes widening at the sudden glow of the screen. No messages. No notifications. The battery was at 1%, but the screen stayed lit longer than it should have. Too long. Long enough for him to see his reflection in the black screen. And something else. Behind him, over his shoulder, movement. He spun, heart in his throat, his breath coming out in quick, sharp bursts. His flashlight beam swept over the trees, searching, but there was nothing. Nothing there. He laughed once, short, harsh, fake. Idiot, he muttered. Just your shadow. Just your... Crunch. His heart stopped. He hadn't moved, but something else had. The sound came from his right. Slow, deliberate, like a boot pressing down on dry leaves. His flashlight swung toward the source, catching nothing but black bark and hanging moss. He stared, holding his breath, his fingers tight on the flashlight handle. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking at the end. It echoed through the woods. Nothing answered. No rustle of animals fleeing. No response. Just quiet. Move. Move now. His legs felt stiff, his movements awkward as he spun back around. The forest seemed thicker. Trees he could have sworn weren't there before now lined his path. He didn't know which direction was forward anymore. His breathing came in shallow bursts. Follow the ridge. Get back to the ridge. He turned toward where he thought the ridge was and moved. Faster now, feet slamming against the dirt with each step. Behind him, a crunch. Then another. Closer. His chest heaved. He didn't turn around this time. Didn't dare. He sprinted, ignoring the branches that clawed at his arms and face. His flashlight wobbled wildly in his hand. The crunching grew faster, closer, pounding behind him, matching his footsteps. Not just one set, more than one. "Stop!" He yelled over his shoulder, his voice cracking. "I have a weapon." He didn't. It didn't matter. They didn't stop. A glance back. Mistake. They were there. Figures in the darkness. Not people. Not people. Their limbs were wrong. Too long. Too thin. They loped between the trees like marionettes. their arms swinging at unnatural angles. Their faces, or what he thought were faces, had no features, just smooth, bark-like skin. No eyes, no mouths. One of them tilted its head toward him, cocking it in slow, unnatural increments. It moved in short, sharp jolts, like something being dragged frame by frame through a broken film reel. Jacob screamed. His legs burned as he sprinted, lungs aching with every gasp. He could hear them behind him. Their steps didn't match his. They were faster. He glanced back. They were running. No jerky, stuttering movements now. They ran like animals, hands and feet pounding the ground in unison, their heads low like wolves in pursuit. He didn't think. He ran. His foot caught on a root, and he crashed face first into the dirt. The flashlight flew from his hand, spinning in wild arcs of light before landing beam up on the ground. Shadows danced madly around him as he scrambled forward, hands and knees clawing at the dirt. Get up, get up, get up. A hand grabbed his ankle, cold, hard, like bark. He screamed, kicking wildly. His boot slipped free. He didn't stop to look. He sprinted. His breath came in short, wild gasps. He didn't hear them anymore. He didn't dare stop. Light, up ahead. He saw it. His heart surged with hope. The ridge, the ridge. He saw the rocky outcrop at the edge of the forest. 30 feet away. 20. 10. His hand hit cold stone. He pulled himself up, dragging his battered, scraped body onto the ridge. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. He crawled until his legs gave out, his body crumpling onto the rocks. He lay there, face down, sucking in great gulps of air, tears leaking from his eyes. He was out. When he looked back at the forest, he saw them. They stood at the edge of the trees. 5 of them, no faces, just those long, twisted limbs and bark-slick skin, their heads all tilted toward him in unison. Watching, the moonlight flickered. One of them raised a hand and waved. Not frantic, not menacing, just slow. A child's wave. Jacob's heart seized in his chest. Slowly he sat up, his eyes locked on them. They didn't move, but the trees behind them did. He saw it now. The forest was growing. Roots snaking upward, trunks splitting and stretching higher toward the sky. Slowly, quietly, the forest expanded. A single branch crept from a distant tree, stretching out in his direction. The bark split, revealing something inside. And I, unblinking, watching him, the forest never stopped growing. It grew in darkness, and now it knew his face. Story number 4. The air in the attic was dry and stale, thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. Dust floated in the slanted beams of sunlight that slipped through the small, round window at the far end. Anna stood at the top of the ladder, her flashlight in one hand, the other gripping the edge of the hatch. Her heart drummed a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. Her grandmother's house had always felt strange, but it was worse now that the old woman was gone. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if every creak of the floorboards was being watched. Her family had come to clean it out, pack up the old woman's things, and sell the property. But Anna had drawn the short straw to clear the attic. She'd rather have been anywhere else. Just old junk, she muttered to herself, brushing aside a cobweb as she pulled herself inside. Her flashlight swept across the space, revealing boxes stacked like crooked towers, faded holiday decorations, broken chairs, and old clothes spilled from open containers. The air was colder up here, not just cool cold, felt wrong. Her eyes fell on the far end of the attic, where the floorboards didn't sit flush with each other. A narrow gap ran between them, just wide enough to catch her attention. Her flashlight beam lingered on it. She tilted her head. Loose floorboards, huh? Her grandmother had always been a secretive woman. She hid money in old jars, tucked away important things in hollowed-out books. Maybe, just maybe, there was something hidden under there. The thought of finding something valuable gave Anna the courage to move forward. Her boots thudded softly against the wood as she crouched next to the gap. Her fingers slid into the space between the boards. The wood was rough and cool to the touch. She pulled. It didn't budge. She shifted her weight, wedging her fingers deeper, and tugged harder. Creak. The sound was sharp, louder than she expected. She froze, listening. The house creaked back. Her heart skipped. Just the house settling. That's what her mother always said. Old houses make noise. Anna shook her head, gritting her teeth as she pulled again. The board lifted with a sudden, harsh snap, nails shrieking as they tore free. She leaned back, panting, her heart beating faster than it should have. The space beneath was a shallow hollow, no more than 6 inches deep. Her flashlight shone into it, revealing the rough underside of the boards and a thin layer of dust. But something was down there. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she reached in. Her fingers brushed against it. Cloth? She pinched it and pulled it free. It was a small cloth bundle tied with a cord. Old, frayed, and stained a deep brown. Took her a moment to realize it wasn't brown. It was red. The fabric had once been white. Her throat tightened, her stomach clenching with unease. Her hands shook as she untied the cord. Inside was a collection of small objects. A child's marble, a rusted key, a bundle of matted hair. At the bottom of the bundle, something small and heavy shifted. She tipped it out into her hand. A tooth, human, yellowed with age, the root still intact. Her breath caught in her chest as her fingers went cold. What the hell, Grandma? Suddenly, she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Her head shot up, eyes darting to the far end of the attic. Nothing moved. She swung her flashlight in a wide arc. Nothing but boxes, dust, and shadows. Her breath came in shallow puffs. The cold air stung her lungs. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it wasn't from the far end of the attic. It was directly beneath her feet. Anna's breath hitched, panic clawing its way up her throat. She stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. She listened with every ounce of her being, straining her ears. Tap, tap, scrape. Her blood ran cold. The sound was coming from under the floorboards, directly beneath where she crouched. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. The flashlight shook in her hands, the beam jerking across the floor. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice higher than she wanted it to be. Her breath fogged the air in front of her. No response. Tap, tap, scrape. She took a step back, eyes wide, focused on the spot where the sound was coming from. The boards vibrated faintly, like something was tapping from below. No, that wasn't possible. Couldn't be. She stepped back again, bumping into a stack of old boxes, her pulse thundering in her ears. Crack. One of the boards snapped upward, the wood splitting jaggedly. Anna screamed, stumbling back as something black pushed up through the gap. Not a hand, not an animal. Fingers, thin, bony, too long, and wrapped in wrinkled, gray flesh. Her heart seized in her chest. No, 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 she gasped, backing away, her breath shallow and wild. The fingers clawed at the air, curling and flexing like they were testing their strength. Another board creaked, then splintered. Another hand. This one moved faster, curling its long, emaciated fingers around the edge of the floorboards and pulling. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping wasn't random. It was a knocking, It was letting the others know it had found a way through. Her back hit the attic wall. Her eyes darted to the hatch, but it was too far. Her gaze snapped back to the floor. Another hand, then another. For in total, curling and scraping at the wood like hungry insects emerging from a hive. Her flashlight caught movement below. Eyes, red, glowing pinpricks in the darkness beneath the boards. Too many of them. "Help," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "Help me." She darted for the hatch. She had to get out. She had to. The floor bucked. Boards snapped upward with a deafening crack. Her feet went out from under her, and she hit the ground hard, the flashlight flying from her grip. It spun across the floor, casting wild, erratic shadows. She scrambled, clawing at the ground, her nails digging into the wood. The hands were on her, cold fingers like twigs wrapped around her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly. One hand let go, but another took its place. Then another. They gripped her legs, her wrists, her arms. The floorboards groaned as something massive shifted beneath them. Her head slammed against the floor as she was dragged backward, her eyes wide with terror. Her last glimpse was of the ceiling, the single round window casting a pale beam of light onto the floor. The light didn't reach her as she was pulled into the gap, inch by inch, hands clawing at her clothes, her skin. She gasped, her eyes locked on that last shard of light, reaching for it. Her fingertips brushed it once. Then she was gone. The boards slid back into place. Dust settled. The house grew quiet again. Below the floor, in the cold darkness, something knocked. Tap, tap, tap. Story number 5. The woods behind Elias's house had always been still. Too still. As a kid, he'd avoided them, unnerved by the eerie quiet that hung between the trees. No birds, no crickets, no distant rustle of animals. Just silence. Thick, oppressive silence. But as he got older, he told himself it was just his imagination. Woods were woods. Stillness was normal. No need to fear something that had always been there. Tonight, though, something felt different. It started with the motion light at the back of his house flicking on. It happened sometimes when the wind blew the wrong way. But tonight, there was no wind. Elias glanced out the kitchen window and saw nothing but the stretch of his backyard sloping down to the edge of the treeline. No movement, no animals, no shadows. Still, his eyes lingered on the trees. There was something wrong about the way they stood. Not the trees themselves, but between them. A space that hadn't been there before. A narrow gap just wide enough for a person to stand. His stomach turned. He moved to the living room, sat on the couch, and turned the TV on, volume low, just enough to drown out the quiet. Stop thinking about it, he told himself. You've seen that spot 100 times before. But no matter how many times he glanced back, he found his eyes drawn to that gap between the trees. Felt occupied. After an hour of scrolling his phone and trying to convince himself he was being stupid, he gave in. He stood, walked to the kitchen window, and peered outside. His breath caught in his throat. There was someone standing there, barely visible in the darkness. A tall figure at the edge of the woods, right in the gap where nothing should have been. They weren't moving. They weren't walking. Just standing. His first thought was a hunter. People got lost sometimes, wandered onto his property by mistake. But the figure wasn't wearing orange or any kind of gear. They were too still. Not shifting weight, not checking their phone, not moving at all. Just standing there perfectly upright. A shiver ran down his spine. He told himself it was just his neighbor messing around. Some dumb prank. He flipped the kitchen light on, hoping to scare them off. The moment the light flicked on, the figure did something that froze him in place. They tilted their head. Not a normal human tilt. It was sharp, fast, like a reflex. like something had heard him. His breath went shallow. He didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes locked on the figure at the edge of the woods, tilted its head again, slowly this time, deliberate, watching him now. The TV buzzed faintly from the living room, the hum of static. He glanced toward it just for a second, and when he looked back at the woods, the figure was gone. "Hell no," he muttered, locking the kitchen door and pulling down the blinds. He told himself it was fine. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear running. It was probably a neighbor's kid being stupid. Some teenager thinking it was funny to stand in his yard and freak him out. That logic worked for about 5 minutes. Then the motion light flicked on again. He didn't want to look, but not looking felt worse. He pulled the blinds back an inch, just enough to see. They were closer, halfway across the yard now. Still, upright, facing him, watching. He backed away, his breath quickening. His pulse thudded in his ears. Call the cops. Call the cops now. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, fingers sliding over the screen. He unlocked it, went to dial, and froze. He glanced back at the window. They were closer, half the distance from where they'd been. Not running, not walking, just there, like the frame of a film that had skipped forward. "No," he hissed, backing into the living room, phone still in his hand. His mind buzzed with static panic. They don't move like that. People don't move like that. He ducked low behind the couch, peering over the armrest toward the window. The blinds were still down. He couldn't see anything now. Couldn't see if they were still out there. Call now. His fingers tapped out the number for emergency services. He hit dial. A soft, distant sound echoed from the kitchen. "Knock! Knock!" He froze. The phone rang once, twice. The dispatcher answered, her voice too calm for the storm in his head. 911. "What's your emergency?" "Knock! Knock!" He didn't speak. He pressed his hand over his mouth, heart hammering in his chest so hard it hurt. There at the back door. No footsteps, no creak of wood, just the knock. He leaned forward slowly, eyes on the hallway leading to the kitchen. The glow from the motion light leaked through the cracks of the blinds. "Sir," the dispatcher said on the line. "Are you there?" The knock came again. "Knock! Knock!" But it wasn't from the door. It was from the window, the kitchen window. His eyes shot toward the window at the end of the hallway. He could see the corner of it from here. For just a moment, his heart stopped. A shadow, tall, its outline barely visible through the blinds. It leaned forward, slowly, looking in. His breath hitched in his throat. He clamped his hand tighter over his mouth, biting down on his knuckles to keep from making a sound. "Sir," the dispatcher's voice buzzed in his ear. "Do you need police?" "Knock! Knock!" It wasn't at the window this time. It was behind him, at the living room window. He turned his head slowly, terrified of what he might see. The blinds were drawn. He could see nothing but darkness through the slits. Nothing but darkness. His eyes searched the narrow gaps, darting from one to the next, heart racing, sweat on his brow. Then, slowly, something moved on the other side of the blinds. A shape pressed against it. Not a face. A hand. 5 long, sharp fingers pressed slowly against the fabric. They dragged down, slow and deliberate, nails scraping softly like a whisper against the fabric. Elias dropped his phone, heart pounding in his ears, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He scrambled back, his eyes never leaving the window. His phone buzzed from the ground. The dispatcher's voice was distant now, like hearing it through water. "Sir, is someone in your house?" she asked, calm but firm. "Do you need help?" The hand pressed harder against the blinds. A second hand joined it, then a third, then a fourth. Too many fingers. Far too many fingers. Elias stumbled back, eyes locked on the window as the shape behind it shifted, the top of it pressing upward like it was growing taller. He backed toward the hallway, his chest heaving. Knock! Knock! This time it came from the front door. They're surrounding the house. He didn't know how many there were now. They'd come from the woods. They'd followed him home. They didn't have faces, but they didn't need them. They only needed to watch. The lights in the house flickered. The power buzzed once, twice, and then it was gone. Darkness fell. In that final moment of pitch-black silence, Elias heard it. Breathing. Not his. Theirs. Close. Right. Behind. Him. Story number 6. No one in Grey Hollow spoke of the Shadow Man, but everyone knew the rule. 7 steps. No more, no less. Children whispered it to each other like a playground game, daring each other to test it. Most never did. Those who tried didn't always come back. It was just an old superstition, Elias told himself. Stories to keep kids from wandering the woods after dark. But as he stood at the edge of the old overgrown path leading to Black Hollow Creek, he felt something different in the air. The kind of stillness that shouldn't exist in the middle of the forest. No birds, no crickets, just the hush of something waiting. He glanced over his shoulder. No one there, no one watching. You're being stupid, he thought. His friend Ben had dared him to come out here alone. Walk 7 steps into the woods. That was it. 7 steps and he could go home. Easy money. $20. 7 steps, he muttered to himself, more for comfort than anything else. The breeze stirred the leaves, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't the rustle of nature. It was something deliberate. He took a breath, tightened his hoodie around him, and stepped forward. 1. The crunch of dead leaves echoed too loud. Felt like something heard him. He glanced up at the trees. No movement. 2. The woods seemed darker than before, the light from the setting sun dimming too fast. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. Just your mind playing tricks on you. 3. His heart was beating faster now. The air felt thicker. He realized he could see his breath, fogging in front of him like it was the dead of winter. His fingers tingled from the cold. 4. He stopped. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around. 4 is enough. Go back. But his pride wouldn't let him. His friends would never let him hear the end of it. He glanced behind him, expecting to see the clearing, the field where he started. But the trees were too close, too tight. His heart stopped for a second. The clearing should be right there. 5. He stepped forward quickly just to prove to himself he could. But it didn't help. The shadows moved differently now. They didn't sway with the trees. They twitched. Jerky. Wrong. His breath came shallow and fast. His legs tensed like they might break into a run at any second. 6. The forest around him changed. The air smelled different, damp earth, but stronger now. The tang of something metallic. His throat tightened, and his breath came out in short, foggy bursts. He glanced behind him again. The path was gone. Only trees now. Closer than before. No, this isn't right. It was just 7 steps. Just 7. One more step, he whispered, his voice cracking. He gritted his teeth and closed his eyes. Just one more. 7. The moment his foot hit the ground, it changed. Silence. Total silence. Not like before. Before, there had been the soft crunch of leaves, the faint whistle of wind. But now, nothing. No birds. No bugs. No breathing. Felt like the whole forest had stopped to watch him. He opened his eyes. There, up ahead, standing between 2 trees, was him, the Shadow Man. He was taller than any man had the right to be, his head brushing the low branches. His body was pitch black, darker than any shadow Elias had ever seen. He wasn't just in the darkness, he was the darkness. The way his edges flickered, the way the blackness moved like smoke, made Elias's stomach twist. He couldn't see a face, no eyes, no mouth, but he could feel them watching. His feet wouldn't move. His body was stone. The shadow man tilted his head slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. The tilt was wrong, too sharp, too far, his head almost sideways. Then he raised his arm, long and thin, with fingers like claws made of pure shadow. Elias felt his heart pound in his chest, every beat like a hammer strike. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: don't run. Running would make it worse. Don't move. Don't move. Don't. The arm stretched forward. It reached for him, slow but steady, the long, clawed fingers moving with purpose. Not hunting, claiming. He choked back a scream, his body locked in place. His mind begged him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His muscles were stone, his lungs tight with fear. The only sound was his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. The shadow man's hand hovered just in front of his face. Fingers like jagged branches. The tips of them hovered an inch from his eyes. His heart felt like it would burst. He tried to lean back, but his body wouldn't obey. The fingers didn't touch him. They hovered there, close enough to feel the cold. Then, the shadow man's head tilted in the other direction, slowly, like he'd realized something. Elias felt it before he saw it. Something was behind him. Hot breath brushed the back of his neck, slow and shallow. He smelled it: earth, rot, and something sweet. His eyes watered as he fought the urge to turn around. Don't turn. Don't turn. Don't look. But the breath was closer now, right at his ear. The breath grew sharp and fast, like whoever or whatever was behind him was smelling him. He squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The claws of the shadow man hovered in front of his face, and something worse loomed behind him. A voice whispered from just behind his ear, so close it could have been inside his head. 7 steps, it rasped. His eyes shot open. He screamed and spun around. Nothing. No one there. Just trees. Just shadows. But when he turned back to the shadow man, he was gone too. He stumbled back, breath coming fast and sharp. His eyes darted in every direction, scanning the woods, looking for movement, for shadows, for that thing. Run. He didn't care about the rules anymore. He didn't care about pride. He turned and sprinted. His heart pounded like thunder as his legs burned, branches slashing at his face, his hands, his arms. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. He ran until his lungs were on fire, until the trees started to thin. He burst into the clearing, tripped, and fell face first into the dirt. For a long time he didn't move, just gasped for air, heart pounding, chest heaving. Slowly he looked back. The woods were still, the shadows still. The light from the sun peeked through the treetops, casting soft beams onto the forest floor. He laughed, wild and breathless, wiping dirt from his face. 7 steps, he whispered, shaking his head. Stupid game. He stood up, dusting himself off. His heart had finally started to slow, but when he glanced back at the edge of the woods, he stopped. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing just beyond the tree-line, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall figure. It didn't move, didn't tilt its head. It didn't have to. It just watched. And this time it wasn't alone. Story number 7. The static came back again that night. It started the same way it always did. A faint, crackling hiss from the old TV in the living room. At first, Eli thought it was just interference. The thing was ancient, one of those bulky tube TVs his grandmother had left behind after she passed. No HDMI, no smart features, just knobs and static when it felt like acting up. But lately, it had been acting up too much. He sat on the couch, controller in hand, a paused video game on the newer flat-screen TV across the room. His headphones hung around his neck, and for a moment he listened. Hiss, pop, pop, hisses. It wasn't white noise, not exactly. There was something underneath it, something faint, too rhythmic, like distant whispers. His fingers tightened around the controller, and his eyes darted toward the old TV in the corner. The screen flickered from black to static, thin white lines scrolling upward in slow, uneven waves. It had been off. He was sure of it. A chill ran down his spine. It's just interference, he told himself. TVs turn on sometimes. Power surge or something. But it didn't feel like that. This wasn't a blip of random static. It had presence. Felt like being stared at. He stood up slowly, the controller slipping from his hands. His eyes stayed locked on the flickering screen, his breath coming out shallow and slow. Don't go near it. But that was ridiculous. It was just an old TV. He took a step forward, eyes narrowing, watching the way the static shifted. The patterns weren't random. The shapes moved together, like ripples in a pond after something broke the surface. He could almost swear he saw something, a shape in the mess of gray and white lines. Stupid, he muttered to himself, stepping closer. His reflection hovered faintly on the glass, warped by the static. He reached for the dial to turn it off. Then it stopped. The static cut to black. His reflection was clear now, staring back at him. But it wasn't just him. Behind his reflection, something moved. It passed across the background of the TV like a shadow behind glass, shifting quickly from right to left. It wasn't him. It wasn't anything in the room. He spun around, heart thudding, eyes scanning every corner of the dim living room. Nobody, no one behind him, just the dark hallway leading to the kitchen, and the faint glow of his paused video game on the other TV. He turned back to the old TV. His reflection was still there, his own wide, terrified eyes looking back at him. His breath fogged the screen. But his reflection wasn't doing the same. He stopped breathing. His reflection didn't. It tilted its head too far to the side, like something studying him, its eyes locked onto his face. No, Eli whispered, stumbling back. His legs hit the couch and he nearly tripped, eyes locked on the screen. No, 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 the reflection smiled. Not him. The grin stretched slowly, far too wide for any human mouth, teeth too sharp, too many of them. The eyes went black, hollow sockets that stared too deeply, like looking into a pit with no bottom. It didn't follow him as he backed away. It just stood there, face pressed against the other side of the screen, hands pressed against the glass from within. Fingers, longer than his fingers should have been. They pressed against the screen like someone testing the thickness of glass. The TV buzzed again, a low hum vibrating the floorboards. The smile on the face in the TV twisted further, stretching to the point where the skin should have torn if it had skin at all. Not real, he whispered, voice shaking. You're not real. The hum got louder. The TV flickered. Static came back, washing over the figure but not hiding it. The face stayed. The grin didn't fade. It knew he could see it now. Stop! He screamed, grabbing a blanket from the couch and throwing it over the TV. The sound didn't stop. The hum only grew louder. He ran to the power outlet and yanked the plug from the wall. Sparks spat from the socket. His heart was racing, every breath feeling like it might be his last. Silence. He leaned against the wall, his hands on his knees, breath heavy and sharp. His ears buzzed from the absence of sound, heart thudding loud in his chest. His eyes darted to the covered TV. No static. No whispers. It's over. It's over. He stood there for a while, unsure if he should leave the room, afraid to turn his back. Eventually, he convinced himself he'd won. No plug, no power. No power, no TV. He let out a shaky breath and glanced at the flat screen. The game was still paused. He just needed to calm down. It's over. But the blanket shifted. Just a little. Just the smallest twitch. Like something underneath had moved. You unplugged it. It's not plugged in. His heart sank into his stomach. He stared, body stiff with terror, eyes fixed on that motionless lump of fabric draped over the screen. He thought, for a brief moment, he saw it breathe. A slow, shallow rise and fall, just once. No, he whispered, his voice barely a breath. No, no, no. The hum came back, not from the TV, from everywhere, low, vibrating his bones. His chest felt tight. The shadows in the room grew longer, the corners darker. His breath fogged in front of him. It's cold. Why is it cold? He moved toward the hallway, slow, deliberate steps. No sudden movements. He kept his eyes on the blanket-covered TV, never turning away, never looking away. If he blinked, it would move. He was sure of it. Halfway to the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He jumped, heart lurching into his throat. He grabbed it, fumbling with it, fingers shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He answered. "Hello?" he whispered, eyes still on the TV. The static hissed on the other end of the line. His blood ran cold. He pulled the phone away from his ear, looking at the screen. The camera was on. The front-facing camera. His own face stared back at him. But it wasn't his face. Tilted its head. It grinned. The phone buzzed. Louder now. The static from the call blending with the hum from the TV. He dropped it. It hit the floor with a crack, but the call didn't end. The sound echoed from the speaker. He turned to run for the hallway. His foot caught. He hit the ground hard, pain flashing through his knees. He gasped and glanced back. His leg wasn't caught on anything. It was held. A hand gripped his ankle. Not his, not anyone's. Just fingers made of static, flickering and twitching, crackling like broken signals. He kicked, screamed, clawed at the floor. The fingers didn't let go. His leg was pulled, his body dragged backward, slow, steady, inch by inch toward the TV. He clawed at the floor, nails digging into the wood, splinters stabbing his fingers. Don't let it take you. Don't let it take you. The blanket slipped off the TV, revealing the static-covered screen. The face was there, smiling, mouth too wide, eyes hollow and black. It pressed its hands against the glass, matching the movements of the hand holding his ankle. Eli screamed, his nails breaking as he dug into the floor. The cold hand pulled him closer, closer. The last thing he saw before the world went black was his own face on the TV screen. Grinning. Story number 8. It started with the candle. Small, unassuming, made of old yellowed wax with a wick that looked like it had never been lit. It sat on the mantel of Sarah's grandmother's house, tucked between porcelain trinkets and dusty picture frames. She hadn't noticed it at first, not until she'd begun cleaning the house after her grandmother's funeral. It shouldn't have stood out, but it did. Something about it drew her eyes. The wax wasn't smooth like normal candles. It had texture, faint impressions, almost like fingerprints, pressed into its surface. Her fingers brushed it as she moved a stack of books, and a shiver crawled up her arm. It was colder than it should have been. Not cool like old wax, but cold. She wiped her hand on her jeans, scowling, trying to brush off the odd sensation. That night, while sorting through her grandmother's belongings, she heard the click. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and distinct. She glanced up from the pile of old letters and saw the flicker of soft, orange light from the living room. Her breath caught in her chest. The candle was lit. Her heart thudded in her ribs as she stood slowly, her eyes locked on the small, flickering flame. I didn't light that, she thought, her skin crawling with goosebumps. Her grandmother didn't even have a lighter or matches in the house. Her hands shook as she approached it, eyes wide. She could feel the warmth of the flame before she was even close. It burned steady, unwavering, even as she leaned in close to inspect it. She glanced around the room, expecting to see someone, anyone, but she was alone. Maybe it was always lit, she muttered aloud, trying to convince herself. But that wasn't true. She'd seen it earlier. The wick had been clean, untouched. Hadn't it? Her fingers twitched. She reached out slowly, cautiously, and pinched the wick between her thumb and forefinger. The fire should have gone out instantly, but it didn't. It didn't even flicker. She yanked her hand back, eyes wide, her heart pounding now. "What the hell?" she whispered. The flame didn't care. It burned steadily, calmly, like it knew it belonged. Her breathing grew faster. She grabbed a small brass cup from the table and, with one sharp motion, flipped it over the candle. Metal clinked against the wood, and she pressed her hand down hard on top of it. For a moment there was silence. No flicker of light, no warmth. "It's out," she thought, relief washing over her. Then the glow seeped out from beneath the rim of the cup. Soft orange light spilled onto the mantel, creeping in thin, sharp beams from the tiny cracks where the cup didn't quite sit flush with the wood. No, 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 no. Her heart slammed in her chest as she lifted the cup, expecting to see the candle snuffed out beneath it. The flame was still there, steady, bright, unbothered. Her breath came faster now. She looked down at her fingers and saw faint red marks where she'd touched the wick earlier. Her fingertips were raw and sensitive, like she'd brushed against something too hot, but she hadn't been burned. Not by heat, something else. "All right," she muttered to herself, her voice cracking. "All right, fine. You want to burn? Burn." She grabbed the candle with both hands, gripping it tighter than she should have. She meant to throw it, chuck it outside, smash it on the concrete steps. But the moment her skin touched the wax, it moved. Her fingers sank into it like flesh. Warm, pliable. She gasped and tried to pull her hands back, but the wax held her. No, no, this is wrong. Her fingers were buried to the knuckles now. The warmth of the wax bleeding into her skin felt alive. She yanked harder, her heart racing, but the wax gripped tighter. She could feel it moving, not like melting wax, no, it was pulling her in. A sharp jolt of pain shot up her wrist. She screamed, falling backward, tugging with all her strength. Her fingers slipped free, red, raw, and slick. She stumbled back, breath heaving, eyes darting to her hands. Her fingertips were coated in a thin film of yellowish wax, like a second skin. She clawed at it, but it wouldn't come off. It didn't feel like wax anymore. Felt like her skin. Her chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. Her eyes darted to the candle. The flame had grown, taller now, brighter. The shadows in the room stretched long and sharp, bending at unnatural angles, flickering like they were alive. The room grew hot. Her eyes widened. It's burning. Not just the candle. Everything. The air shimmered with waves of heat, but nothing else in the room caught fire. Not the books, not the curtains. Just her. Her skin prickled like she'd spent too long in the sun. A slow crawl of heat that moved from her hands, up her arms, to her chest. She ran to the sink, slamming the faucet on, water splashing everywhere. She shoved her hands under the water, but it didn't help. If anything, it hurt worse. Steam hissed from her skin, the smell of burning flesh filling her nose. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as she clawed at her hands, but the waxy coating didn't budge. She glanced back at the living room. The candle was still there, still burning. The flame was taller now, almost a foot high, and through the glow, she saw something moving inside it. Not a shadow, a shape, two hollow eyes, sunken, empty sockets. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands burned, her arms now tingling all the way to her shoulders. Her skin felt tight, like it was shrinking, like it was hardening. She stumbled toward the door, but her legs didn't feel right. Her knees wouldn't bend. Her steps became slow, heavy, like her joints had locked up. She looked down at her legs and saw yellowish wax running in uneven streams from her calves. Her breath hitched. No, 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 she screamed, clawing at herself, but it was too late. Her arms were stiff now, her fingers unable to close. The wax crawled up her neck, her heart beating so fast she thought it might burst. Her eyes darted toward the candle one last time. The hollow eyes in the flame were watching her. The flame flickered just once. Then everything went still. Her body stood motionless in the center of the room, eyes wide with terror. Her face frozen in an expression of pure panic. Her skin had hardened into smooth, polished wax. Her hands, half raised, locked in mid-motion. The candle's flame dimmed. It shrank, lowering itself to a soft, gentle flicker. The house was silent now, save for the faint crackle of the tiny flame. The glow from the candle lit up the motionless wax figure of Sarah, her eyes still locked in that final moment of terror. The flame danced happily on its wick. It had fed, but it was still burning. It would always burn. Story number 9. The call came at midnight. It always did. Evelyn lay in bed, eyes wide open, her heart already beating faster than it should have. Her phone sat on the nightstand, face down, but she didn't need to see the screen. She knew it was about to happen. It had happened every night for the past week. At exactly 12 a.m., her phone buzzed. Not a soft, short buzz like a message, but a long, insistent vibration. Her stomach twisted, breath shallow, eyes locked on the phone. Don't answer it this time, she told herself. Don't answer it. But she knew she would. She always did. Something about it made it impossible not to. Her trembling hand reached for the phone. She flipped it over. No number, no caller ID, just unknown caller. Her thumb hovered over the answer button, her heart thudding like thunder in her chest. She glanced at the clock. 12 a.m. exactly. Every night. Same time. The phone buzzed again, and she winced. Her thumb pressed accept before she could stop herself. "Hello," she whispered, her voice so quiet it barely counted as a word. Nothing, just static. Faint, like a distant radio station not quite tuned in. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows in the corners. She knew she was alone, but something about the silence on the other end made it feel like she wasn't. "Who is this?" she said, a little louder this time. Her own voice echoed in the quiet bedroom. The static shifted. Not louder, just closer. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed the phone tighter to her ear. It wasn't just static anymore. Beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of breathing. Shallow, ragged, wet. Her throat went dry. "Who is this?" she repeated, barely louder than before. The breathing didn't stop. It was slow, too slow. Whoever it was, they were holding each breath like it hurt to exhale. Each inhale sounded like it was being dragged in through broken lungs. Then she heard it. A voice, quiet, soft, but too clear to be mistaken. It was a woman's voice, crackling through the static like it was being spoken through a broken speaker. Evelyn, her name. It wasn't a mistake. She sat bolt upright, her eyes darting around the room. The phone felt hot in her hand now, like it was pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "Who is this?" she asked again, her voice sharper, more desperate. The breathing stopped. So did the static. The silence was absolute. Then, the voice spoke again, softer this time. "Help me." Her blood turned to ice. Her whole body went stiff. Her fingers locked around the phone like it had fused to her skin. It was faint, but she knew that voice. She knew it. She hadn't heard it in 2 years, but it was her mother's voice. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her throat tightened as she struggled to breathe. "No," she whispered. "This isn't real. You're not. Help me, Evelyn." The voice was louder now, closer. No static this time. Just her mother's voice, raw and broken, like she'd been crying for hours. "You're dead," Evelyn whispered, tears rolling down her face. "You're dead. I was at your funeral. You're not real." The static came back, sharp and violent, like the roar of 1,000 radios. Evelyn pressed the phone to her ear, breathing hard, her chest tight with panic. Then, in the middle of the static, she heard something else. Not her mother's voice. A new sound. A scraping sound. Something hard being dragged across wood. Long, steady pulls like fingernails clawing at a door. Her head snapped toward the bedroom door. It was closed. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself, eyes wide with terror. But her heart didn't believe it. Her ears didn't believe it. The scraping sound came again. Slow. Closer. Her pulse was a wild drumbeat in her chest. She wanted to hang up. Her thumb hovered over the red button, but her body wouldn't let her do it. "Please," she whispered into the phone. "This isn't real. It's not real. You're not real." The static hissed and crackled. "Let me in." Her breath caught. Her eyes shot to the door. Her heart squeezed so tight it hurt. The voice wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from behind the door. Her hands started to shake. Her lips quivered as she bit back a sob. "No," she whimpered, tears flowing freely now. She backed away, her legs weak and trembling as she pressed herself against the headboard. "You're dead. You're dead." The scraping stopped. The silence was worse. She sat frozen, not daring to breathe, not daring to blink. Her eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to move. The phone was still pressed to her ear, and she heard it. The breathing. But this time it wasn't on the phone. It was in the room with her. Slow, shallow, wet. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room. A shadow moved. Not the kind that shifts with the flicker of a light. This one moved. It peeled away from the darkness, unfolding itself inch by inch. Limbs that were too long. Arms that bent the wrong way. A shape that shouldn't exist but did. Her breath hitched in her chest, frozen in her lungs. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. Her phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the blanket. The glow of the screen cast faint light on the figure, just enough for her to see its face. It had no face, just a hollow space where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Her mind fought to make sense of it, but it couldn't. Her eyes refused to understand what they were seeing. Tilted its head, slow and deliberate. It had no eyes, but she knew it was looking at her. The phone buzzed once more. Her screen lit up with an incoming call. Unknown caller. Her scream caught in her throat. She didn't answer this time, but it didn't matter. "Let me in," the voice said. It was right next to her. Story number 10. The first time Lauren noticed something was wrong with the mirror, she brushed it off as exhaustion. It had been a long week, and sleep deprivation could play tricks on the mind. She was brushing her teeth late at night, her eyes half-lidded with fatigue, when her reflection lingered. It was a subtle thing. Her head turned slightly to spit into the sink, but in the corner of her eye, her reflection hadn't moved. Not right away. It was only for a fraction of a second, the kind of moment where you aren't even sure it happened. But it was enough to make her stop. She leaned forward, staring into the mirror. Her reflection stared back, perfectly in sync. She tilted her head left. It followed. She raised her right hand. It mirrored her. Normal. It's normal. Losing it, girl, she muttered, rubbing her face. Her reflection did the same. The next night it happened again. This time, she was washing her hands. She glanced up at the mirror and froze. Her reflection's head was already tilted, eyes locked on her. Lauren blinked, and her reflection tilted its head back to normal, smooth as silk. Her heart thudded in her chest. She leaned in close, squinting at her own face. Her reflection met her gaze with the same suspicion. "Stop it," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. She raised her hand slowly, fingers curling into a fist. Her reflection copied her perfectly. Normal. Totally normal. But just as she lowered her hand, her reflection smiled. Her breath caught in her chest. She wasn't smiling. Her face was stone still, lips pressed in a hard line. But the thing in the mirror was grinning. Her eyes locked with its, her breath short and sharp. Her reflection's smile wasn't natural. It was too wide, too forced, like someone stretching their face into a grin with hooks. Her eyes never changed. Her heart pounded in her ears as she took a step back. It's stress. It's just stress. Mirrors don't work like that. Her phone buzzed from the kitchen. She spun, breathing hard, and rushed out of the bathroom, shutting the door behind her. She didn't go back in that night. The third night, she covered the mirror. An old bedsheet draped over it like some old horror movie trope. Felt stupid, but she did it anyway. It wasn't like she needed the mirror that badly. She slept with her bedroom light on that night. At 3:12 a.m., she woke up to a sound. It was faint, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped open, heart already racing. She sat up in bed, blinking away sleep. Her room was quiet, too quiet. She strained her ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the bathroom. Her stomach sank, ice-cold terror flooding her veins. She didn't want to move. She didn't want to look. But something in her, some primal instinct, made her stand. Slowly, slowly, her bare feet touched the cold floor, her breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs. The tapping didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't fast. It wasn't frantic. It was patient, deliberate. Her hands shook as she reached for the bathroom door handle. She stood there, fingers barely touching the cold metal. Her breath fogged in the cool air. No, don't open it. Don't look. But she had to know. Her hand twisted the knob slowly. The hinges creaked as the door swung open. Her eyes flicked to the mirror, the sheets still on it, the still covered. The tapping stopped. Her heart thudded in the quiet. She leaned in slowly, fingers still on the door. Her eyes darted to the bottom edge of the mirror. The sheet was still there, draped over it, hanging still. Her breath slowed. Nothing's there. It was just, knock, knock, knock. She jumped back with a yelp, eyes wide as she stared at the mirror. That didn't come from the door. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. It came from the other side of the mirror. Her hands flew up to her mouth to muffle a scream. Her body was locked in place, legs trembling, her back pressed against the wall. No, no, no. The sheet twitched, just a little, A shift like someone brushing it from behind. The fabric moved as though something was pressing on it from the inside. Her whole body went cold. Her eyes stayed locked on the mirror. Knock! Knock! The shape pressed harder. Not a hand. A face. She saw the impression of eyes, nose, and an open mouth pressing against the fabric. Her throat closed up. Her breath hitched in shallow gasps. Her legs refused to move. She felt tears well up in her eyes. "Go away," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please go away." The face pushed harder against the sheet, pressing so tight she could see every feature now. The sunken eyes, the too wide grin, the hollow cheeks. Her face. It was her face. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, scrambling backward on her hands and feet. Her head hit the doorframe. The impact made her vision blur, but she didn't care. Her eyes stayed locked on the mirror. The face on the other side smiled. Wider, wider, far too wide. His teeth weren't her teeth. They were sharp, pointed, hungry. The face pressed harder against the sheet until the fabric strained. Then the sheet ripped. Her scream echoed through the house as she scrambled to her feet, running for her bedroom. She didn't dare look back. She slammed the door shut and locked it, shoving her dresser against it. Her heart thudded so hard she thought she might pass out. Silence. Her ears buzzed with the sound of her own pulse. She sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, eyes locked on the door. No footsteps, no scratching, no tapping. It's gone. It's gone. Then her phone buzzed. Her whole body went rigid. Slowly, she reached for it. Her fingers shook as she flipped it over. Her breath stopped. The notification was a photo of her bedroom door. From the other side, her eyes darted to the gap under the door. A shadow moved. Her phone buzzed again. A message. Just 2 words. Look behind. Her body froze. Her eyes stayed locked on the door. She knew she shouldn't. She knew. But her head turned anyway, heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. Her reflection stood behind her. It wasn't moving. It wasn't copying her. It was just staring at her. Her reflection smiled. Wide, too wide, teeth like knives. Found you, it whispered as it lunged. If you enjoyed this chilling tale and want to dive deeper into the world of horror and the unexplained, please subscribe, like, and share this video. Join us for more spine-tingling content that will keep you on the edge of your seat.